Okay, here we are. We're back in action. I'm going to share that. In slideshow. Okay, so before we had that little break from the echo, another thing we do need to talk about too is just railroads. This is going to be one of the reasons why we're going to call the American Civil War the first modern war. Industrialization is being used to peak advantage. Interestingly enough, the South is the first one to use the railroads at Bull Run, but that's neither here nor there. Basically, when it comes to railroads, what you need to know is the North and the Union is what we'll call the North is going to be the ones who uses the railroads the best. Basically, it's put in under Lincoln that it's going to be run by the government as another arm of the war machine, and it'll help bring the industrial power to bear against the South. The South does not nationalize their railroads at any point. It's still privately run and still pretty piecemeal. If you look at this map right here, you can see there's a huge spider network of railroads in the north. It's a little more sporadic down south, and that's going to be a huge factor. They can move things very fast. Okay, so of course, like I said before, the first battle of this war is going to be at Fort Sumter. The Confederates are going to fire on the fort in Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. They're going to bombard this thing. Interestingly enough, very few casualties, if any, except for like one guy, if I remember correctly, the story goes, during the celebration, when the flag comes down, his cannon actually blew up on him. So either way, as this goes on, early on in the war, things do not go well for the Union by any means. There's problems with command, figuring out who's going to be the main general. Some of these guys are just too old. Winfield Scott, who came up with the whole Anaconda Plan, was arguably still a very brilliant general, is very old. He can't exactly lead people in the field, so they have to find some other guys. There's just a whole host of problems, and the Union doesn't do well, really, in the first year or two of the war. Things start to change, though. So that's when we get to Antietam. Antietam, what you do need to know about this one is it's the single bloodiest day. It's not the bloodiest battle, it's this bloodiest single day battle. We'll have on both sides combined, we'll have 22,720 estimated casualties. Basically, Robert E. Lee, leading the Confederate Army of North Virginia, tries to invade Union territory and cut off the capital, and he is stopped and turned back at the Antietam Creek, what the Confederates called Sharpsburg. And basically, it's a bloodbath. They hang on by the thinnest of margins. This is where, if you are doing this with kids, depending on the age of the kids, you have some great photos you can do, and some of them are just scary clear. This one's not that clear, but this one kind of shows you just the carnage. According to one private of the 6th Alabama, this is the sunken road, one of the heavier spots of fighting. You could walk 250 yards in the backs of dead Confederates. So this was just gruesome. This war is going to be the deadliest war in American history. Will kill over 600,000 Americans. Now, the reason why you do need to know this battle is after this battle, Lincoln will issue the Emancipation Proclamation. This is one thing 242 does want you to know. And the big thing about this one is, oddly enough, it's a twofold thing, really. One thing, it only frees slaves in the southern states that are in rebellion. It does not count for the border states. Basically, if they're in the border states, those slaves are technically still slaves. It only frees those in the Confederacy. Main problem, the Confederacy is not listening to Lincoln. But what it does do is it does allow its commanders to take slaves and be okay taking slaves, because now they're operating under orders from Southerners as they march through the South. It also allows Lincoln to start using African Americans and African Americans as soldiers in the Union Army. This will begin about this time too, and it keeps the British and the French out. There have been several times they came fairly close to intervening, maybe because something the Union did or just the way they thought the war was going. In fact, before the Battle of Antietam, the foreign minister of England was talking to the prime minister and basically was told they'll wait to see if anything else happens. If the Southerners had another major victory, They were seriously considering intervening. But the fact that Lee was turned back at Antietam gets them to back off a little bit. And when this is issued saying this is now a war for slavery, to end slavery, it's now a crusade for freedom, France and Britain cannot intervene, because if they do, it's going to make them look really bad back at home, something that neither government would want. This is by no means the end of the war at all. This is just the beginning. Okay, the next thing the 2-4 Treaty wants you to know is that basically Gettysburg is really the turning point. Before the battle, it's actually stated several times in several different histories that I've read and come across, that basically the Union, the Northern morale was at its lowest. Basically, things hadn't gone perfectly after Antietam by any means, but it was a good battle for the Union, but they still had many defeats after that. At Gettysburg, Lee invades the North proper. He invades Pennsylvania. And at Gettysburg, basically what starts out as a skirmish between basically the vanguard of both armies, it turns into a 3-day battle that is going to be the bloodiest battle of American history, and definitely the Civil War. It's going to kill estimated, these are just estimates once again, because it's one of those things of like, we don't always know how many, because casualties also includes killed, wounded, and missing. So we got 46,000 to 51,000 estimated total. So we're going to lose a whole bunch. Basically, what's going to happen here is after this, Lee will never be on the offense again. He is the main commander of the Confederate forces, but this pretty much breaks his offensive power. He can, after this point, he's pretty much on the back foot. He will never invade the North again. And it really shows the Europeans that, yeah, the Union has teeth. They can do what they need to do. Next thing you definitely need to know is the Battle of Vicksburg. This one happens about the same time as Gettysburg. And it's basically, this is a siege. They take Vicksburg, and now the Union controls the Mississippi River. So not only do they have the blockade going around the entire coast, they now have one going up the middle of the Confederacy, cutting them in half. They can't be supplying part of the Confederacy through Mexico anymore. They're cut off. This is a huge thing. To kind of bring this thing in home, they unleash Sherman. According to 2-4 Treaty, what they want you to know, they do want you to know Sherman's March to the Sea, which is interesting because in 8th grade, the Teagues don't really bring him up at all, so cool. The thing about him that's good to know is basically he's unleashed from Chattanooga, and he marches clear down to Savannah, Georgia, laying a huge path of destruction, burning crops, burning towns, destroying railroads. Basically, like when they're tearing up the railroads, they were so thorough that they would pile the ties in big bonfires, take the rails, heat them up on these bonfires, and then twist them around trees so they could not be used again. So this was meant to just break the South. This is definitely the definition of total war. Everything's game. And this is, of course, 1864 when he goes through his march to the sea. So basically, things are really stacking up against the Confederates. On April 9th, the war's over. At Appomattox Courthouse, we'll have General Lee surrender. When you talk about this, sometimes people will talk about the different merits of the general. They're both very brilliant men. If you want to get into the argument who's better, that's neither here nor there for us. That's more of a fight for different historians in my book. But yeah, so Appomattox Courthouse is the one another one you need to know. This is basically the last battle. Lee surrenders. Basically, they decide, okay, we can't keep doing this. If we keep doing this, all we're going to do is drag on the misery and the pain. There's no way we can win. So Lee surrenders the main army to Grant on April 9th, 1865 at Appomattox Courthouse. The other armies will start surrendering very soon after. This is the end of the war. The Union has won. Richmond's already been taken and burned. But this, of course, is not the final thing. 6 days later, Abraham Lincoln is killed at Ford's Theater by a conspiracy that was planning on killing a bunch more people, but really only succeeded in killing Lincoln. This is, of course, John Wilkes Booth, and is really something that probably made Reconstruction a little bit worse for the South. The reason why I say that is one thing that 242 wants you to know is the different plans for Reconstruction. So Reconstruction was basically the plan of rebuilding the South because it was where most of the battles had occurred. They had lost the most. So basically the Union realizes if they're going to bring the South back in, they don't want to bring back in this mangled up piece of territory. So they plan on rebuilding it and also putting some things back the way they think it should have been in the first place. So Lincoln's plan was pretty much probably the easiest. He was talking about wanting to bring it back quickly and fairly, saying, okay, we fought a war, but we are still brothers, we are still family. You swear allegiance to the Constitution, end slavery, and you can come back as a state once 10% of your people have done it. That's all you had to do. Not too strict. Well, when he's killed, that goes out the window. This is never used because of that. With Andrew Johnson, the worst president in U.S. history, but he's not big for us right here, come in. But what does get used is the radical Reconstruction passed in 1867, where basically this becomes punishment for sure. Congress divides the South into 5 military districts ran by Union generals such as Philip Sheridan, John Pope, Daniel Sickles, a couple of the 3 famous ones. The other ones, I'll be honest with you, you don't hear too much about. And basically, it's going to be run martial law. No state could return to civilian rule unless they had readmitted the Union be readmitted to the Union until both white and black voters framed a constitution that guaranteed voting to African Americans and ratified the 14th Amendment, in addition to the 13th Amendment. So the 13th Amendment is passed that ends slavery. The 14th is talking about that if you were born here, you are automatically a citizen, and no state can deny you your rights as a U.S. citizen. It's one of the few, if not the only amendment. The 14th Amendment is one of the few, if not the only amendment that actually turns and talks to the states. Most amendments are talking to the federal government originally. So that's a really big thing about the 14th. And also, very interesting thing, it banned Confederate leaders from voting and any who didn't pledge their allegiance to the U.S. So basically, it disenfranchised or took away the voting rights of many Confederates. This is going to anger the South very much. So yes, once again, 13th Amendment, it's going to abolish slavery. This is passed 1865, right after the wars ended. 14th Amendment was all about making sure that the South could not legally treat the freedmen, these former slaves, differently. They get granted full citizenship rights. No state can violate your rights of life, liberty, and property without due process of law. Everyone's supposed to be treated equally. And then the 15th Amendment is passed saying that if you are a citizen, you can vote. Once again, unfortunately, this is only for men. Women will get the right to vote in 1919. So we're heading that way. It's getting better. Okay, of course, the South is not going to sit back and just take this. They have lots of reactions against this. So one thing they talk about is they do want you to know kind of some of the nicknames they had for different people who worked with the government when it came to Reconstruction in the South. Basically, carpetbaggers were basically people from the North coming down, sometimes to work in the government. Sometimes they were seen as just profiteers coming down to profit off the South's misery. And they're called carpetbaggers because that was the normal suitcase at that point in time. That's where you get this little cartoon right here, which is kind of fun, where he's kind of freaky looking with the long legs and glasses and a very angry face. Bag in front of him filled with others' faults he always sees, the one behind him he never does. Things like that. Call him a hypocrite. And then scalawags. Scalawags was basically people from the South who worked with the government, generally Republicans. They often were seen as traitors by their family and friends. That's why they're called them scalawags. Okay, so one thing that was passed to help out these former slaves was the Freedmen's Bureau was established in 1865. This whole thing was to basically help out these former slaves with things about talking about food, clothing, medicine, other supplies, because a lot of these guys had been basically kept by plantation owners. So this is going to help them transition to freedom, help them kind of care for themselves, as well as also setting up schools to help them learn to read and write and do things like that. And at one point in time, one thing they wanted to do was a program called 40 Acres and a Mule. The whole idea was to take some of these plantations, break them up, and set up former slaves in their own small holding farms. That way they could take care of themselves. And have a mule would be kind of like having a tractor back in the day. You could basically use that to help plow your land, to reap the harvest and do things like that. Of course, as time goes on, this goes out the window because the South starts taking control back slowly. And there'll be a lot of fights against the Freedmen's Bureau, and eventually it will go away. Now, the plantations did not go away by any means. They were still there. The thing is, the plantation owners had lots of land, but to help the labor force of slaves was gone, legally speaking. So they come up with the idea of sharecropping. And one thing, this is very interesting, is that the idea of sharecropping does not only hit African Americans, this hits basically anybody who was poor. This is the whole idea here is it's a form of debt slavery, really. You are free, you are not legally owned by anybody, but in exchange for a part of your crop, the landowner will rent you the land and also a place to live. And we were doing this with the kids the other day, and they kind of got some interesting looks on their face when we started talking about the fact that, like, yes, they will help take, if you need groceries, which of course you do, because you're growing stuff that takes time, or you're growing stuff that's meant to be sold. So you can use credit down at the local grocery store and you can pay that back with more of your crop. Eventually, as things go on, they can't afford to leave. So basically, it reestablishes the idea of master a little bit, just not quite so forcefully it was under slavery, and basically gives the plantation owners or landowners a bit of their labor force back. So there's pictures from some sharecroppers. This is one's actually a little bit later on. This is from 1907. You can see this one right here. This is from around Georgia. This is an African American family. They're on their rented land doing that. But once again, one thing to know is sharecropping was not just based on color. It was basically based on class. Like if you didn't have a lot of money, you could be a sharecropper. But once again, you got to realize you're stuck. Okay. Now, that's kind of putting economics back a little bit the way it was before. So throughout Reconstruction, states will start trying to pass black codes, and some of them will actually get these things done, and they'll be in places here and there limitedly. But this is basically trying to treat the former slaves like they were under slavery still. I'm talking about restricting their freedoms. Some cases, like this one right here from Louisiana, where they couldn't rent any place in town, so they have to live out in the country. Once again, making them easier to recruit as labor forces back on the plantations, things like that. Things like you couldn't walk on the same sidewalk, various things like that. This will later turn into Jim Crow. After Reconstruction is gone, the South will institute laws that basically some racist laws that keep African Americans as politically inferior, which will be called Jim Crow. And we'll talk about those in just a minute. Other things they did too, violence is going to be a very common tactic. This is where the Ku Klux Klan appears the first time. So this from about 1866 to 1870, they exist as a terrorist group. Basically, they're beating up anybody who's trying to help out the African Americans. If you're trying to help them vote, they'll beat you. They'll beat prominent African Americans. They'll basically break up rallies. They'll burn farms down. They'll just whip people. They're using very scary costumes, like you see in this cartoon over off to the right from Thomas Nast. It was all about fear. So much so that the U.S. government will actually pass a force act allowing them to use military force to put these guys down, and they will be gone after 1870. because the United States government does not play around with this. And they'll be gone until the early 1900s when they resurface. Other times they'll just be using just plain intimidation. It wasn't always a close play, and it could just be a group of very angry locals near the polling areas to beat people if need be. If violence wasn't their style, they had some interesting ways of denying rights too. Within the black codes and later Jim Crow, they'll pass things like poll taxes, basically making it where if you want to vote, you need to pay some cash. Don't have any cash? Sorry, keep on walking. You can't vote today. Other times they would do things like literacy tests, which if you ever get a chance, you can look up some old literacy tests, and they're just, the rules on them are just stupid. Like no one can follow them. The whole idea is for that exact reason, that exact thing. If they wanted to, they could use a grandfather clause. Basically, if your grandfather could vote before, you can vote too, if you couldn't pass the literacy test or pay the poll tax. So there's ways around it if they wanted to, not always. Of course, they'll also pass the Amnesty Act, which allows a lot of former Confederates to vote. And basically, things are starting to get back the way they used to be before the war. Because as Reconstruction goes on, it is less politically popular in the North the closer we get to 1877. That's where we get the Enforcement Acts. We're going to send troops to oversee the elections, things like that. 1877 is officially the end of Reconstruction. And this one, what happens is basically there is pretty much a tie between Hayes and Tilden. And Hayes makes the deal with the Democrats saying, hey, if you transfer your votes to me, I'll pull the soldiers out of the South, which allows you guys to do what you want to do. And basically, the South is back the way they want to be. They're back in control. This is going to be the era of Jim Crow. Reconstruction is over. Now, after that, one thing that 242 does want to talk about too is also Plessy versus Ferguson. This is a little beyond 8th grade U.S. history. And Doc, I'm sure you guys do this in high school history, don't you?
Yes, that is part of the curriculum, Plessy versus Ferguson.
Yes. So this one's interestingly enough, like some of the stories around this is interesting because Plessy, you can see him right here, Homer Plessy was considered under the law black. He could pretty much pass for white. What happens is basically he's on the railroad in Louisiana. He has to sit in the car reserved for what they call the colored car. He has to sit back there according to an act of 1892. The conductor that stopped him and actually quote unquote arrested him was actually a friend. That's why he knew he was black and not white. And this was meant to be like a test thing, like, okay, maybe we can get this law thrown out. The only problem is when this gets to the U.S. Supreme Court, they rule separate but equal. So separating the races, but giving them quote unquote equal things is perfectly legal. And this will be the law of the land all the way till the 1960s. Specifically, actually about the 1954, the Brown versus Board. But there'll be other cases we'll have to go through for other things besides education. And that basically brings us to the end of our presentation today.